So, you want to scare the pants off your readers, players, or what have you, but you want to come up with a sleep paralysis demon of your own rather than relying on some other type. Well, today we're going to be talking about world building your own monsters and all that might entail from design to implementation. We've just been doing lots of spooky stuff on this channel recently, and about a month and a half too late for Halloween, but I guess that's just how it is. Anyway, this video should be helpful to you whether you're working on a novel, tabletop RPG, or general world building project. So the first thing I'm going to cover is that monsters are an insanely broad topic, especially when it comes to what people even count as a monster. Most people can agree a dragon is a monster, but is a dinosaur, since they were once real? Is Bigfoot a monster? Or just a hairy guy? If it's just the mythical nature that makes something a monster, are gnomes monsters? These are all, of course, very stupid questions, but I bring it up just so I can define it for our purposes today. A monster, by our definition, will be a fictional creature that is in some way dangerous to humans or humanoids. Very broad, but doesn't cut out anything specific that would definitely be something we'd count as a monster. I can't say things like, well, monsters can't be humanoid or we lose zombies and vampires. I can't say that they can't be sentient or we lose vampires again and also some dragons. Alas. Anyway, step one, what do you need it to do? This is basically your concept phase. Often in my experience, you find you need a monster to fit with a concept or requirement within your story. They're often a reason for something in of themselves. Why is that part of the ocean unexplored? Oh, it's because there's a crack in there. That kind of thing. Why are the forests dangerous? Well, there are these goat people who will beat you with hammers. That general idea is the foundational concept for what your monster will be. Often they fill a space in some broader concept. Where they aren't making a place dangerous, they may be instead making a concept, faction, or some other thing dangerous. Demons are a good example, and we'll get on to talk about them more, but especially in fantasy settings, they're often the foot soldiers of evil gods, and that setup demands its own provisions. Essentially, what I'm saying here is to drill down what you need your monsters for, but I'd say there are three main purposes from which you can draw that need from. The first is the locational threat. This is like the Kraken or the Beastmen I was talking about earlier. These kinds of monsters have the additional consideration of needing to subsist within their environment. In this type is where you'd find monsters that are animals in the sense they are a natural part of their environment. Or even if they're an introduced part, they still coexist with whatever's there, even if they're something of an invasive species. This can create a lot of interesting designs and concepts for monsters, as these are the types more than any other that don't tend to exist for any reason to do with humans or civilization unless they were put wherever they were by an outside force. They are just a danger of the area that does not care for the intentions of those who are traveling through it. A good example here would be like 99% of the inhabitants of Warhammer Fantasy's Lustria continent. Sure, many of the creatures that live there are under the thrall of the sentient lizardmen, but many others just wander the jungle looking for people to eat. These include giant arthropods, titanic snakes, literal dinosaurs, and all sorts of flesh-eating parasites and the like. Within the lore of Lustria itself, and especially those who explore there, it's generally accepted to be one of the most dangerous places in the world, and the chances of any given expedition going missing are so high that it's essentially a given. This dynamic is a lot of fun because with the right setup, it can prey on that sort of primal fear. The Jurassic Park kind of fear, where you have the awareness that people were not meant to deal with this kind of threat and that they are not on the top of the food chain in this environment. I personally find this is strongest in oceanic environments. Humans, relative to actual sea creatures, are terrible swimmers, so introduce a giant shark, squid, or what have you, and the person is going to be completely out of their element. What I'll actually throw out there real quick is that I think giant sharks and squids can be a little overdone, though they're still very cool, but I think something like a titanic jellyfish of sorts would make for a great monster. Even the tiny ones in real life can be horrifically dangerous, so imagine this scene. You have a character swimming through the water, and there are these strange tendrils floating in the area that they think are plant life, because there are so many of them and they don't seem to be moving all that much. Then a sort of bioluminescent light shines from below them and the tendrils close in, not just pulling him in, but stinging him as he goes down. Sounds pretty horrific to me. One of the other types of monsters you might be dealing with is the factional monster. That is to say that this is a monster that, even if it's not entirely aware of it, serves a greater power. Demons are the main example of this, and the best example of those, in my mind, are the demons of Warhammer. I don't even specify Fantasy, Age of Sigmar, or 40k, because it's the same demons in all of them, down to them having the same named characters. But there, the demons are regimented into units and types by Chaos God, all behaving differently and having disparate strengths and weaknesses based on which god they serve. Khorne, the Lord of War, has frontline demons called Bloodletters, which are strong all-around fighters with powerful blades and high skill. Nurgle, the god of Plague, has the Plague Bearers, which are durable, disgusting, and diseased. And then, of course, you have Slaanesh, who's the god of Excess, with her demon nets, which are lithe, fast, and deadly. Tzeentch, the Lord of Trickery, has 3 types because he makes everything complicated. You start with pink horrors, which have knives and throw magic. Then you kill it and it splits into 2 blue horrors, which have knives and throw magic. And you kill those, and then you get 2 brimstone horrors who don't get the knives anymore, but they still have magic. Fun! Each have further variants that emphasize the qualities of the gods they represent, and that's what you should aim to do if you're going for a set of factional monsters. The set of monsters I'll show off later that I made are also factional, but we'll get there in a bit. The last primary type of monster is the individual monster. This category refers to a monster as being individual, not necessarily in the sense that there's only one of them, but in the sense that only one example of this monster will be particularly important to your plot. The classic example of this would be Moby Dick, who technically fits our definition of a monster because while Moby Dick is nominally a normal sperm whale, its albinism, aggressiveness, and sort of personality, if you could quite say that, stretches him a bit into the supernatural. In any case, Moby Dick is the archetypical example of the individual monster alongside your usual suspects like Dracula, Frankenstein, and really most other classic monsters. Bigfoot is often viewed this way. The Loch Ness Monster also is. Lots of cryptids kind of fit this too. This category overall is essentially the grab bag of everything else, but there are some points to be made specifically for them. When you have fewer monsters, typically each one is going to become more important. Nobody really cares about the personality of your average bloodletter of Khorne. I mean, I'm sure I could talk all day about blood and skulls and violence, but that isn't exactly why the bloodletter is an effective monster. Individual monsters have a personality, even if it isn't in any way a human-like one. They also tend to have deeper kind of meanings or things that they represent more often. Moby Dick is a monster that exemplifies Captain Ahab's journey for revenge and how that dooms him and most of those around him. That is Moby Dick's purpose within the story. Individual monsters don't all have to be the center around which your story revolves, but they do tend to warrant some extra attention in terms of the conceptual reasons of why they exist and what it means that they do. Now we're going to move on to step 2, design. This is, for good reason, one of the most favored parts of creating a monster. Getting to design the monster and decide why exactly most people will take one look at it and run the other way. There are so many potential designs for monsters that I couldn't hope to do any sort of useful overview in general, other than to give a good example and explain how I personally went about doing it. So some good monster examples as far as design goes would be xenomorphs from the Alien movies for one. They're a good example of implementing body horror, unfamiliarity, and a distant echo of humanity in their design. Body horror is effective because most people do not exactly feel comforted by the idea of a tiny carnivorous alien bursting out of their chest. Unfamiliarity is basically just saying it's a unique design and a well thought out one. Xenomorphs look believable and realistic even in the kind of old and not as high budget first movie. And that sort of thing is helpful given the tone of the films from which it comes. You believe their existence. This concept is most noticeable when it's done wrong, or just not done up to our current standard, which you might see in older horror movies or when you look at something like this. I know I just dunked on that monster last video, but I just had to do it again, though yes, I do understand why it looks the way it does. Then, of course, comes the distant echo of humanity. Anatomy is generally in the same place, which is all it really takes. Monster designs can be, in a way, categorized into vaguely humanoid and non-humanoid. It isn't the most helpful designation because everything is humanoid or non-humanoid, but their purposes can be different. More humanoid designs can benefit from the uncanny valley effect, where something looks kinda right from a distance, but then the more you look at the details, the more disturbing it becomes because of those places where it diverges from humanity, whereas less humanoid designs are less restricted but don't benefit from that effect. However, you can always mix the two, as the creators of the AMC show The Terror did. Ha! You thought I wasn't going to mention it again, but I did. Anyway, the toonback of The Terror was actually designed intentionally to have some human features. As one of the visual designers said about it, that was our starting point, making sure that even from the side view we get the brows and the deep-set eyes and the human quality of those eyes. Sometimes it only takes a little bit of humanity to impart a whole new quality into a monster's design. From this point, I'll describe how I went about designing some of my own monsters. I'm definitely a fan of humanoid monsters, especially from a horror perspective. I also needed factional ones because I was designing them to be the dark servants of the ultimate force of corruption in my fantasy world. I wanted to go for designs that really sort of bridged the gap between them believably being humans, if horribly twisted, or actual supernatural creations. I really liked that idea, not being able to tell if what you're fighting was once just like you or if it was always some sort of abomination. The first part of my process was opening a website called Hero Forge for 3 reasons. 1, my drawing skills wouldn't even win a competition consisting only of 3rd graders. 2, I needed to implement these into a tabletop RPG campaign I was running. And 3, Hero Forge, especially with the recent updates, is probably one of the best character designers out there, if not the best. Some people are absurdly good, way better than me at using it. In any case, I had 5 archetypes that needed filling. The Horde, the Standard, the Brute, the Armored, and the Leader. Both in a gameplay purpose for the sake of the campaign and in a conceptual stance, I figured this would cover any need I had, at least for a good while. Anyway, I suppose I'll do a slight viewer discretion warning for what I'll show here. It's nothing all that crazy, but I feel like I might as well. So the first thing I came up with is the Husk. While the robes and the hood hit a sort of cultist-y vibe, I went with matching the skin color with the strange wrappings on its arms and legs. Is that cloth? Is that part of its skin or some sort of just growth? It's unclear, and that's what I liked about the design. I then removed the eyes from the sockets because that brings in a little more of the, was this once human question? Why would it be designed to have eye sockets if there are no eyes? These ones aren't particularly dangerous, essentially being a mob-style unit that is mainly threatening enough just by being a source of corrupting magic, so they don't have a whole lot else going on. Next we have the Reaver, my standard type, which may be my favorite design. I went with the obscured face simply because scary face syndrome I find often doesn't work well, and especially with the rest of the design in mind, it probably would have come off as more edgy than I would have been able to tolerate. I took off his right arm and replaced it with a blade, once again bringing back that once human question, because that implies he used to have an arm there, and then posed its left hand to be sort of contorted, an indication it's in pain or channeling some sort of fell power. I threw on the skull for a bit of visual interest, because, you know, it can never go wrong with a good skull on a bad guy, and then the dagger as another unanswered question. Will it pull it out to dual wield, or is it for some other fell purpose? Next we have the Enraptured. Brute types are kind of hard to make scary because there's always that bit of goofiness from it basically just being a big guy, but I worked with it. I like the idea of the spinning chain weapons, as from a gameplay perspective it'd make it act different, but I also thought said chains sort of encircling it would offer it a kind of unique vibe. I threw one around its neck because I think it being called the Enraptured, it sort of gives it like this weird contrast of it's chained but it's smiling, and by its own name it's the only one implied to be kind of having a good time being what it is. And you can kind of guess why. You know, it's bigger and it's stronger than most of the other ones around it, and that rictus grin really sells the effect. It's even exalted enough to be blindfolded rather than just be bleeding out of its own eye sockets. After that, we have the Cataclysm Warrior. I love the vibe of the Chaos Warriors from Vermintide 2, these hulking, corrupted, walking tanks. I wanted some of that. However, in making a guy in armor, he is in some way the most human of the monsters here, so I took away any visibility of his face. Just this ragged grate of a helmet. I like the idea with these of them being entirely silent, almost giving off the idea that they're just a possessed suit of armor, yet with the movement of something that is almost certainly actually alive. Finally, we have our leader, the Herald. More than the others, I wanted this one to look like an actual thinking being, something that really makes you wonder if this is some hopelessly corrupted cultist. It's covered in bones and a half skeleton on its back, and it's bearing that unique ghostly blue witch fire, which I think helps it to stand out, and also emphasize that this thing wields sorcery. With that, I've essentially shown off the monsters I made for that purpose. Hopefully that was some help, but if nothing else, I think they're neat. Anyway, now that we've covered design, we can move on to step 3, implementation. So now you have your concept fulfilled, you've designed your monster, and you're ready to unleash it upon the unsuspecting denizens of your world. Well, what's next? That brings us full circle in a way, because the implementation is going to depend on how you intended them from concept. I'd say there are essentially 3 types of ways to implement a monster. Monster as obstacle, monster as foe, and monster as predator. And I don't mean the one from the movie, but I also do because it is an example of one. Monster as obstacle ties into the locational monster archetype most strongly, which is to say that this monster isn't necessarily one that's going to actively seek out and kill your characters, but will prove to cause problems if your characters interfere with its standard operation. However, monster as obstacle can also be used in the Sphinx sense, where it actually isn't particularly interested in attacking you, even if you're right in front of it, but instead acts as a literal obstacle that you don't need to fight or kill, but instead outsmart or impress in order to get what you want out of it. Monster as obstacle is one of the more common implementations of monsters, especially in more mythical stories, as it's often the monster of trials, one that you have to beat in order to advance on your quest. The 12 Labors of Heracles are some of the most famous examples, with perhaps the most known of those being, in part due to the movie, the Lernaean Hydra. This monster only even existed for the sake of killing Heracles, so it really couldn't fit the archetype any better. You can, of course, use the monster of obstacles in a more literal sense too. Imagine some sort of giant bull centaur thing patrolling a valley between 2 mountains that's too strong to kill, but not aggressive enough to be an active threat, and you essentially have an effective example of that interpretation. Lynels in the recent Legend of Zelda games are actually kind of an example of this, because you just sort of have to avoid them in the early game. The second is the monster as foe. This is one of the more common examples in modern media, best emphasized by the orcs of Tolkien-esque fantasy. They are much like humans, but inherently adversarial for one reason or another. D&D has rehabilitated them, so to speak, into another fully sentient race, a la dwarves and elves, whereas Warhammer settings turn up the craziness to 11 and morph them into British football hooligans. Both work, but only the latter leaves you with a monster. The former just gives you a person with tusks. Monster as foe also applies to certain kinds of demons, those which aren't monster as predator anyway. The types of demons Doomguy fights, though maybe in predator classification for everyone else, are foes for him. Perhaps he is the monster as predator for them instead. In either case, monster as foe is one that your characters can feasibly defeat. That doesn't mean it's easy. An ancient, nearly all-powerful dragon such as Alduin from Skyrim is still a monster as foe, because as Dragonborn you are capable of defeating him, even if it does require you to grow powerful to equal his own strength first. When implementing these, it often becomes useful to develop the rest of their society, or if one isn't present, their tactics, strengths, and weaknesses. For this, I'll use Warhammer Fantasy's orcs and its demons to demonstrate. With the orcs, their main strengths are their overwhelming numbers, brute strength, and ability to harness the capabilities of several even less intelligent beings, such as trolls, giants, and thanks to their little goblin pals, Arachnarok spiders, which, personally, if I was on the other side of a battlefield from, I would immediately run away. Their weaknesses are that they are incredibly stupid, infight almost constantly, and are at a significant technological disadvantage to essentially every other group around. With the demons, their strengths are their enhanced strength, and durability due to not even being made of physical matter. They also have their corrupting influence due to being emissaries of eldritch and extremely powerful gods, and then they have their specialization based on allegiance. Their weaknesses are inverse to their strengths. Their not being made of matter makes them durable, but it also makes them temporary, as the warp they come from tries to suck them back in. Their corrupting influence is a powerful tool, but those with strong enough faith can banish or stand against them with that alone. Their specialization is due to their own infighting. Nurgle hates Tzeentch, so they often don't help each other, even though their strengths do complement one another. Nurgle could use the damage-dealing spells of Tzeentch, and Tzeentch could use the durability, but both end up with neither. Think along these lines, and you'll be well on your way to developing a monstrous foe for your world. And finally, we have Monster as Predator. Monster as Predator is the type horror movies are made from generally, and I've said a lot about making horror work, especially with creatures, in both my videos about cosmic horror and about horror in general, but what I'll say is that horror monsters work better when they are smarter as a general rule. Even if not in a human intelligence way, they need to be cunning, and they also need to have a key advantage over your hero. Even in movies that aren't really horror like Terminator and Predator, they both have Arnold Schwarzenegger in them. They also both have monsters that are more technologically advanced than the people they're around, and both monsters are also intelligent, at least relatively so, making them credible threats to the protagonists. Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime chasing you around would already be scary, but make him a indestructible robot from the future and you have quite the formidable threat. Monster as Predator, given that the scales are tipped in favor of the monster, is a category where you need to consider that balance fairly carefully. There is definitely a temptation to make them kind of overpowered, but they too need weaknesses just as any other kind of monster does. The main difference comes in that weakness either not being one that leads to its demise, that is harder to discover, or that is particularly difficult to exploit. That first kind of weakness may be found in a subcategory of monsters that contains types that may be delayed but never defeated, so to speak. The type that can only be put down for a time but will always return. The second kind is sort of a general purpose and should be the case most of the time. The monster isn't going to be as scary if you know how to beat it early on, especially if the capability to beat it is possible from the beginning. That also could just lead to the audience calling the character stupid if they know the weakness and don't exploit it. But alas. The final type, where the weakness is difficult to exploit, is pretty solid, and best exemplified by the idea that the xenomorph of Alien is weak to being thrown into space, as I imagine most things are, but it wasn't exactly easy for Ripley to actually make that happen. Either way, Monster as Predator can be strong in as many ways as you see fit, so long as its weakness or weaknesses are well thought out and exploited in the right way and time. With that, however, I think we've about covered world-building monsters. I hope you enjoyed, and since we're still small here at JBat, a like and a subscription go a really long way. If you want to hang out with my editor and I, we have a Discord, and if for some reason you're crazy enough to want it, we also have a Patreon where you can get early access to videos. Anyway, thank you for watching, and remember, the answer to the Sphinx's riddle is man.